The alarms were screaming. $100 million on the line. 20 engineers frozen in failure when the janitor dropped her mop, picked up a marker, and rewrote the impossible. The CEO didn't blink, didn't breathe, just watched as one woman in gray gloves fixed what his entire company couldn't. And what she said next didn't just save his empire, it shattered everything he thought he knew about genius. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. To understand why a janitor could fix what a room full of experts couldn't, you have to follow Cynthia beyond the glass, back to the nights when equations were easy, but life was not. The next morning, whispers ran through every hallway like electricity through copper wire. The janitor fixed the code. No way. I'm serious. Silva sent out an email. Some laughed. Some didn't believe it. Some felt their degrees shrinking in their pockets. But Ricardo Silva did believe, because he'd watched it happen. He stood now in his corner office, the city sprawling below him like a circuit board of light and motion. In his hand was a coffee he hadn't touched. On his screen was a name he'd typed an hour ago. Cynthia Huntley. The results were sparse. A few academic papers from nearly a decade ago. An unfinished thesis on autonomous decision-making systems. Dropout records from MIT's doctoral program, dated 6 years back, right around the time her publication history went silent. No social media, no LinkedIn profile proclaiming expertise or hunting for opportunity, just absence. He stared at the thesis abstract. The language was dense, brilliant, ahead of its time. This wasn't someone who'd failed. This was someone who'd stopped. Why? Across the city, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment where the radiator clanged and the neighbors argued in muffled Spanish, Cynthia Huntley knelt beside a small bed. "Did you brush your teeth?" she asked. Evan nodded, his gap-toothed smile catching the light from the hallway. He was 5, almost 6, with her dark eyes and his father's chin. A chin she tried not to notice. "Good." She tucked the blanket around him, smoothing it with the same precision she used to arrange code. "Now sleep. Tomorrow's library day." "Mommy?" "Yeah, baby?" "Did you fix the robots again?" She paused, surprised. She'd mentioned her work exactly once, months ago, in the vaguest terms a kindergartner could handle. "Maybe," she said, smiling. "A little. You're the smartest." Her throat tightened. "Get some sleep." She kissed his forehead and stood, closing the door until only a sliver of light remained, just enough to keep the dark from feeling too big. In the kitchen, she made instant ramen and sat at a table scarred with ring stains and crayon marks. Her phone sat beside the bowl. No calls, no messages. It had been like this for years. Once people called, advisors, colleagues, friends who weren't really friends, just people who liked being near bright futures. When hers dimmed, they stopped calling. Her husband, ex-husband, had left 3 weeks after Evan was born. No fight, no explanation, just a note that said, "I can't do this," and an empty closet. She'd tried to keep going, tried to finish her doctorate while nursing and surviving on 2 hours of sleep, but childcare cost more than her stipend. Her advisor grew impatient. Her research stalled. One day, she just stopped showing up. She took the first job she could find, then the second, then the third. Now she cleaned floors at the place where she once believed she'd change the world. The ramen had gone cold. She ate it anyway. She didn't know that across the city, a man who could have ignored her was instead pulling up her published work, reading it with the focus he reserved for acquisition targets. She didn't know he'd already made a decision. She only knew that tomorrow, she'd wake at 5, take 2 buses, and punch in before the engineers arrived. because that's what survival looked like. And survival, for now, was enough. The following morning, Cynthia's supervisor handed her a sealed envelope. Maria's expression was unreadable, somewhere between confusion and caution. CEO requests your presence. Boardroom A, 9 o'clock a.m. Cynthia's heart dropped into her stomach. She started. I don't know, Maria shrugged. But you don't keep Ricardo Silva waiting. The envelope felt heavy. Cynthia turned it over in her hands, the company logo embossed in silver. She'd cleaned 1,000 offices in this building, but had never received anything with her name printed on it. Ms. Cynthia Huntley. Not cleaning services, not facilities. Her name. She checked the clock. 1 hour. By 8:57 a.m., Cynthia stood outside Boardroom A in her cleanest pair of jeans and a sweater she'd ironed twice. Her work uniform was folded in her locker. She'd debated wearing it, maybe that's what he expected, but something told her not to. She knocked. Come in. Ricardo Silva stood by the glass wall, hands in his pockets, the skyline painting golden reflections across his tailored suit. The city stretched behind him like a kingdom he'd built from wire and will. He turned. Ms. Huntley? She stepped inside. The door closed with a soft, expensive click. Please, sit. She sat. He didn't. For a moment, he just studied her, not unkindly, but with the focus of someone used to evaluating worth. I owe you thanks, he said simply. You saved a $100 million project, and possibly my company. Cynthia's throat went dry. I was just cleaning. No. His voice was firm but not harsh. You were thinking. He walked to the table, resting his hands on the back of a chair. I looked you up. Her stomach twisted. MIT. Published at 23. Thesis committee that included 2 Nobel candidates. He paused. Why did you stop? The question landed like a stone in still water. She could have lied, could have said it wasn't for her, that she'd changed her mind, that she'd found other passions. But he'd already read her work. He knew better. Life got complicated, she said quietly. Ricardo nodded. He didn't press. Instead, he said, I want you to assist my R&D team, just for observation. You'll sit in on meetings, review workflows, offer input if you see something. Cynthia blinked. Sir, I can't. You can't what? Think? You already did that. He leaned forward slightly. I'll handle the scheduling and the pay increase. I have a son. I know. That's why the pay matters. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Ricardo's expression softened, just barely, like light through a crack. You gave this company a miracle, Ms. Huntley. Let me give you a chance. The room fell silent except for the hum of the city below. Cynthia felt something she hadn't felt in years, something she'd buried beneath bills and bus schedules and the weight of just getting through the day. She felt seen. Not as a janitor, not as a dropout, not as someone who'd failed to finish, as someone who still had something to offer. When do I start? She asked. Ricardo smiled. It was small, controlled, but genuine. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock a.m. Wear whatever you want. She stood, legs unsteady, and extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm. Thank you, she said. Thank you, he replied. Now go. You've got a lot to prepare for. She walked out of Boardroom A with her heart pounding and her mind spinning. Somewhere in her pocket her phone buzzed. A text from the daycare. Evan drew you a picture. Says it's a robot. She smiled. Maybe miracles came in pairs. Within days, Cynthia was attending morning technical meetings. still wearing her gray janitor uniform. She'd asked Ricardo if she should dress differently. He'd simply said, "Wear what works." So she did, because buying new clothes meant choosing between that and Evan's field trip fee. The choice wasn't hard, but walking into a room full of engineers in blazers and button-downs while wearing polyester with her name stitched on the pocket, that was harder than any equation she'd ever solved. Some engineers smirked. Others ignored her entirely, their eyes sliding past as if she were furniture. "Does she even belong here?" one whispered to another during a bathroom break. Cynthia heard it. She always heard it. Ricardo caught it too. He stood near the door, coffee in hand, expression unreadable. He didn't correct them, didn't defend her, didn't make a scene. He simply let her brilliance speak. During a tense session on data synchronization, the senior systems analyst, a man named Greg with 15 years of experience and a degree from Stanford, presented a flowchart that had taken his team 3 weeks to build. "This should resolve the latency," Greg said confidently. "We've isolated the bottleneck to the API calls." Ricardo studied the screen. "Run the simulation." Greg clicked. The system lagged, then stalled. "That's odd," Greg muttered. Cynthia leaned forward slightly. She'd been silent for 40 minutes, watching, absorbing. Now her eyes traced the flowchart like a map only she could read. "It's the pipeline," she said quietly. The room went still. Greg turned. "Excuse me?" "Your data pipeline. It's misaligned at the 3rd node. You're calling the API before the cache updates. It's a sequence issue, not a bottleneck." Greg's jaw tightened. "That's not—" "Run it again," Ricardo said. "Reverse nodes 2 and 3. Greg hesitated, then made the change. The simulation ran, smooth, fast, flawless. Silence. Then Greg muttered a stiff, "Good catch." Cynthia said nothing. She just looked down at her notes she'd been scribbling on the back of a cleaning checklist. Ricardo didn't hide his admiration. His eyes stayed on her a moment longer than necessary. Late that evening, as the others filtered out, some still murmuring in disbelief, Ricardo approached her. She was packing her things, a worn notebook, a pen she'd found in a drawer, a thermos that had seen better days. "You don't speak much," he said. She glanced up. "I'm used to people not listening." Her tone wasn't bitter, just factual, a truth worn smooth by repetition. Ricardo leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Well, I do." For a moment, neither spoke. The office was nearly empty now. The city glittered beyond the glass, indifferent and infinite. "You knew the answer the moment Greg started talking, didn't you?" Ricardo asked. "About 12 seconds in," she admitted. "Why wait?" She shrugged. "Because if I'd said it right away, they would have dismissed it. I had to let them need the answer first." Ricardo studied her, the sharpness behind the humility, the strategy behind the silence. "That's exhausting," he said quietly. "Yeah." She met his eyes. "It is." Something shifted in the air between them. Not large, not obvious, just a subtle pull, like gravity recognizing gravity. He saw her, not as a risk, not as a project, but as an equal he hadn't known he was missing. And she saw him, not as a billionaire, not as a boss, but as someone who understood what it meant to be underestimated. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Same time," she replied. He smiled, small, almost private. Good. As she left, he stayed behind, staring at the flowchart still glowing on the screen. 3 weeks. A team of experts. 12 seconds. One woman in a janitor's uniform. He poured himself another coffee, and for the first time in years, Ricardo Silva admitted something he rarely allowed himself to feel. He was impressed. Ricardo began spending more time near the R&D wing. For progress reports, he told his assistant. But everyone noticed. The CEO didn't typically hover. He delegated. He reviewed summaries. He appeared for milestones, not mundane Tuesday afternoon check-ins. Yet there he was, again, leaning against a doorframe, coffee in hand, watching the woman in gray gloves jot equations on scrap paper between tasks. She still cleaned. That was the arrangement. Half her hours in R&D, half in facilities. She'd insisted on it. "I can't afford to lose the base pay," she'd said. "Not until I'm sure this is real." So she thought in the mornings and mopped in the evenings, her mind never fully leaving one world for the other. And Ricardo watched. Not obviously, not inappropriately, but enough that his CFO had started making jokes. "Thinking about acquiring her too?" Daniel had asked. Ricardo hadn't laughed. One evening, after a 14-hour sprint to prepare for an investor demo, Ricardo walked the empty halls out of habit. The building was silent except for the hum of servers and the distant whoosh of the ventilation system. He passed the R&D wing. The lights were still on. Inside, slumped over her workstation, was Cynthia. Asleep. Her head rested on her folded arms, dark hair spilling across a keyboard. Beside her monitor, pinned with scotch tape, was a crayon drawing. A lopsided robot with a smiling face and the words, "My mommy builds robots," scrawled in uneven letters. Ricardo stood in the doorway, unmoving. She looked exhausted, not just tired, worn. The kind of fatigue that came from years of running on fumes, from choosing between sleep and survival, from loving someone so much you'd break yourself to keep them whole. He walked quietly to the corner, pulled his suit jacket from the back of a chair, and draped it gently over her shoulders. She stirred, but didn't wake. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the drawing, at the equations sprawled across 3 monitors, at the thermos that probably held cold coffee, and the granola bar wrapper she hadn't had time to throw away. Something inside him cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet fissure in the wall he'd built 5 years ago, when the woman he'd planned to marry died 3 weeks before the wedding, when he'd decided that loving people was a liability he couldn't afford. He'd buried himself in work, in success, in the clean logic of business where loss was measured in dollars, not heartbreak. But standing here, watching this woman fight for a future she wasn't sure she deserved, he felt something he thought he'd buried for good. Hope. Not for himself, for her. He left without waking her. Cynthia woke an hour later, disoriented. The office was dark except for her monitors. Her neck ached. Her mouth tasted like stale coffee. And draped over her shoulders was a suit jacket. Expensive. Tailored. Still faintly warm. She sat up, pulling it around herself, and caught the scent. Subtle cologne, cedar, and something crisp she couldn't name. She looked around. No one. But on her desk, next to Evan's drawing, was a sticky note in sharp, efficient handwriting. "You're doing better than you think. R." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her notebook. Her fingers brushed the fabric of his jacket. Soft. Probably worth more than her rent. She smiled faintly, whispering to the empty room, "Maybe not all CEOs are heartless." She stood, draped the jacket over her chair, and gathered her things. Tomorrow, she'd return it. Tonight, she'd let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe the world had space for second chances after all. "Strictly professional," Ricardo had said when he extended the invitation 3 days prior. But as he adjusted his tie for the 4th time in the back of the town car, his heartbeat told a different story. The restaurant was a quiet place on the 40th floor. No celebrity clientele, no paparazzi, just floor-to-ceiling windows and a city that glittered like a promise beneath them. Cynthia arrived in a simple black dress she'd borrowed from her neighbor. She'd agonized over it for an hour, texting apologies about returning it cleaned. But when she stepped out of the elevator and saw Ricardo standing by the host stand, the anxiety quieted. He smiled. Not the boardroom smile, something softer. "You look lovely," he said. "You look terrified," she replied. He laughed, genuine and surprised. "That obvious?" "A little." They were seated by the window. The skyline shimmered below them, alive and indifferent, 1,000 stories unfolding in light. For a while, they talked shop. Safe territory. The upcoming product launch. The latest simulation results. The way the engineering team had finally stopped side-eyeing her in meetings. But then the wine arrived, just one glass for her, sparkling water for him, and the conversation shifted. "Tell me about Evan," Ricardo said. Cynthia blinked. "You really want to know?" "I do." So she told him. About the way Evan arranged his toy cars by color and size, the same way she organized code. About his obsession with space and his insistence that she was going to build robots that could go to Mars. About the bedtime ritual where he made her promise every single night that she'd never stop being smart. "He doesn't know I stopped," she said quietly, tracing the rim of her glass. "He thinks I've been building robots this whole time. That cleaning was just something I did on the side." "You let him believe that?" "I didn't want him to think dreams die." She looked up. "Even when they do." Ricardo was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. "They didn't die," he said finally. "They just waited." Her throat tightened. "You know," she said, deflecting before the emotion could land, "you're not what I expected a billionaire to be." He raised an eyebrow. "No? No. I expected someone colder, more detached." He chuckled, low and warm. "And you're not what I expected a janitor to be." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone less—" He searched for the word. "Unsettling." "Unsettling?" "In the best way." He leaned forward slightly. "You see things no one else sees. You solve things no one else can. And you do it without needing applause." He paused. "That's rare." "So is a CEO who notices," she said softly. Their eyes met across the table. The city hummed below. The candle between them flickered. Neither looked away. "Why did you really invite me here?" Cynthia asked. Ricardo considered his answer carefully. He could have deflected, could have fallen back on professional courtesy or networking or any of a dozen safe excuses. Instead, he told the truth. "Because I wanted to know you," he said simply. "Not the engineer, not the employee. You." Cynthia's pulse quickened. "And?" she asked. "Do you?" He smiled. "I'm starting to." The waiter arrived with dessert, something delicate and French that neither of them had ordered. "Compliments of the chef," he said. They shared it, laughed about the pretentiousness of edible flowers. Argued playfully about whether AI would make better decisions than humans. Let the conversation drift into easy, unguarded territory. The night ended on the sidewalk outside, the city cool and alive around them. "Thank you," Cynthia said, "for tonight. For all of it." "Thank you," Ricardo replied, "for reminding me why I started building things in the first place." She smiled, hesitated, then, on impulse, stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. It was brief, innocent, but the warmth lingered long after she'd stepped into her rideshare. Ricardo stood on the curb, hand brushing the spot where her lips had been, and realized something he hadn't let himself admit until now. He was falling, and for once, he didn't want to stop. The auditorium held 300 people. Investors in tailored suits. Journalists with cameras and cynicism, Executives whose quarterly bonuses depended on the next 45 minutes going flawlessly. And at the center of it all, on a stage bathed in cool blue light, stood Ricardo Silva. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady and commanding, "thank you for joining us. Today, you'll witness the future of autonomous systems, Project Ether 2.0. The lights dimmed. The massive screen behind him flickered to life. For the first 10 minutes, everything was perfect. The simulations ran seamlessly. The AI adapted in real time. The robotic arm assembled a complex mechanism with inhuman precision, while the algorithm narrated its own decision-making process. Gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd. Ricardo allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Then, the interface lagged. It was subtle at first, a half-second delay, a stutter in the visual feed. But Ricardo saw it. His chest tightened. "Continuing to phase 2, he said smoothly, advancing the presentation. The screen froze. The robotic arm stopped mid-motion, suspended awkwardly in space. The murmurs started immediately. Ricardo's lead engineer, Greg, appeared at the edge of the stage, pale and frantic. "Sir, something's wrong with the core processor. It's rejecting inputs." Ricardo's jaw tightened. "Fix it." "We're trying, but—" The display turned red. Error codes cascaded across the screen like a digital avalanche. Panic spread through the room. Investors exchanged glances. A journalist in the third row started typing furiously. Ricardo's pulse hammered. It was happening again. The same nightmare that had nearly destroyed the company months ago, now unfolding in front of everyone who mattered. He opened his mouth to stall, to offer reassurances he didn't feel. And then, from the shadows at the back of the auditorium, someone moved. Cynthia. Still in her gray uniform, a cleaning cart abandoned near the door. She walked down the aisle, every eye turning toward her. Whispers followed her like a wake. "Who is that? Is she staff? What's she doing?" Ricardo's eyes found hers. She didn't ask permission, didn't hesitate. She climbed the stage steps and approached the terminal. "Ms. Huntley," Greg started. "Move," she said quietly. He did. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, eyes scanning lines of code that scrolled faster than most people could read. The room had gone silent except for the rapid clicking of keys. 30 seconds passed. She stopped, highlighted a section of code, deleted it. "There," she muttered. "Faulty injection at the API gateway. Someone pushed an update without clearing the cache dependencies." She rewrote the sequence, live, in front of 300 people, then pressed enter. The screen flickered. The error codes vanished. The display turned green. The robotic arm resumed its motion, smooth and perfect, completing the assembly as if nothing had happened. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then the applause started, uncertain at first, then building into a roar. Cynthia stepped back from the terminal, hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. Ricardo just stared at her, not with relief, not with gratitude, with awe. She had done it again, saved everything, saved him. He crossed the stage and extended his hand to the crowd, but his eyes never left hers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding, "meet Cynthia Huntley, the architect behind Ether's resurrection." The applause doubled. Photographers surged forward. Investors leaned in, suddenly interested. But Cynthia barely heard them. She only saw Ricardo, and the way he looked at her, like she'd just rewritten his understanding of what was possible. "You saved me," he said quietly, barely audible over the noise. She smiled faintly. "You gave me the chance to." He wanted to say more, wanted to pull her aside, away from the cameras and the chaos, and tell her everything he'd been feeling since that first night she'd fixed the unfixable. But the crowd pressed in. Questions flew. The moment dissolved into motion. Still, as Cynthia was ushered backstage by his PR team, Ricardo made himself a promise. No more waiting, no more hesitation. She deserved to know, and he was finally ready to tell her. The email had gone out at 7:00 a.m. sharp. Subject: Urgent company meeting. All staff, 9:00 a.m. No explanation. No context. Just a calendar invite marked mandatory. By 8:45, the grand atrium was packed. Employees lined the railings on every floor, leaning over to see the stage below. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. New contract? Maybe bonuses? I heard we're going public. Cynthia stood near the back, still in her uniform. She'd tried to slip in unnoticed, but ever since the demonstration, that had become impossible. People nodded at her. Some smiled. A few even stepped aside to let her through. It felt surreal. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the lights dimmed. Ricardo walked onto the stage. He wore a suit, as always, but something about him was different. Looser, almost nervous. In his hand was a small black box. The screen behind him flickered to life. One sentence appeared in bold white letters. Never underestimate quiet brilliance. The room fell silent. Ricardo took a breath. Most of you know what happened last week, he began. Our flagship project nearly collapsed in front of 300 investors. It should have been a disaster. Heads nodded. Some shifted uncomfortably, remembering the panic. But it wasn't. Because one person, someone most of you had overlooked, stepped forward and saved everything. His eyes scanned the crowd. Cynthia Huntley didn't just fix a system. She reminded all of us that brilliance doesn't require a corner office or an Ivy League diploma. It doesn't need recognition or applause. It just needs a chance. He paused, his voice softening. And she reminded me that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about listening, even to the quietest voice in the room. Cynthia's heart began to race. People were turning, looking for her. Ricardo descended the stage steps. The crowd parted. He walked straight toward her. Oh, God. Her hands went cold. Her breath caught. He stopped directly in front of her, the entire company watching, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. Cynthia, he said quietly, though the mic clipped to his lapel carried his voice to every corner of the atrium. You fixed $100 million problem. You saved my company, my reputation, my future. He opened the small black box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, with a single diamond that caught the light like a captured star. But more than that, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. You fixed me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ricardo knelt. The atrium erupted in whispers, gasps, a few muffled shouts of disbelief. Cynthia's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. I spent 5 years convinced I didn't deserve this, that I'd lost my chance. That love was something I'd buried with someone I couldn't save. His voice cracked slightly. And then you walked into my life with a mop and a mind that wouldn't quit. And you reminded me that second chances are real. He looked up at her, eyes glistening. Cynthia Huntley, you are the most brilliant, resilient, extraordinary person I've ever met. And I don't want to spend another day without you in it. His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. Will you marry me? Time stopped. The atrium held its breath. Cynthia looked down at this man, this impossible, brilliant, broken and healing man, kneeling in front of hundreds of people, offering her everything. She thought of Evan, of late nights and empty bank accounts, of dreams deferred and dignity scraped together one shift at a time. She thought of the girl she'd been at MIT, so sure the world was hers for the taking. And she thought of the woman she'd become, the one who'd survived, who'd fought, who'd refused to let circumstances define her worth. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, through tears and laughter, "Yes!" The atrium exploded. Applause thundered from every floor. Cameras flashed. People cheered and whistled and shouted congratulations. Ricardo stood, hands shaking as he slipped the ring onto her finger. And then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, soft and deep and full of promises neither of them had dared to hope for. When they finally broke apart, foreheads touching, he whispered, "I love you." "I love you too," she whispered back. And somewhere in a kindergarten classroom across the city, a little boy named Evan was drawing another robot. This one had two people standing beside it, and they were holding hands. That evening, under the soft hum of the city skyline, Cynthia stood beside Ricardo on the rooftop of Silva Dynamics, the same rooftop where they'd had dinner weeks ago, where something unspoken had first taken root. Now, everything had changed. Ricardo held two items in his hands. In one, her old janitor badge, laminated plastic with a photo from 6 years ago, when exhaustion had been her only constant companion. Cynthia Huntley, Facilities Services. In the other, a new badge, sleek, weighted, real. Cynthia Huntley, Chief Innovation Officer. He handed it to her. She turned it over in her hands, fingers tracing the engraved letters as if they might disappear. "It's official," Ricardo said softly. "Board approved it unanimously this afternoon." "They didn't have a choice," she said with a small smile. "You own 51%. "True," he grinned. "But they would have approved it anyway. You've already saved this company twice. They know brilliance when they see it." She looked down at the old badge, then back at the new one. Two pieces of plastic. Two versions of herself. One she'd worn to survive. One she'd earned by refusing to disappear. "I'm keeping this," she said, holding up the old badge. "Why?" "To remember." She slipped it into her pocket. "To remember that I made it. That we made it." Ricardo's expression softened. He stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Below them, the city pulsed with light and motion. Somewhere in that vast grid of lives and stories, the news was already spreading. On her phone, silenced but glowing, notifications piled up. Messages from former classmates she hadn't heard from in years, requests from journalists. And one headline, trending across every platform: CEO proposes to janitor who saved his $100 company. She'd read it once, then put the phone away. Let them talk. Let them spin it into whatever narrative fit their assumptions. She knew the truth. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was two broken people choosing to rebuild, together. Cynthia looked up at the stars, barely visible against the light pollution but present nonetheless. "For Evan," she whispered. Ricardo glanced at her. "What?" "That's what I kept telling myself, every shift, every sleepless night, every time I wanted to give up." She smiled, eyes distant. "I told myself it was for Evan, so he'd have a chance I didn't." "And now?" She turned to face him fully, the new badge still in her hand. "Now it's for both of us. For all three of us." Ricardo pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other and the quiet promise of everything they'd built. "You didn't just fix my company," he said finally. "You rewrote our story." "We rewrote it," she corrected. "Fair enough." Behind them, the rooftop door opened. Ricardo's assistant stepped out, tablet in hand, then immediately froze. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to—" "It's fine," Ricardo called back. "We're done here." The assistant retreated quickly. Cynthia laughed. "You're going to have to get used to people interrupting us." "Worth it," he said, kissing the top of her head. They turned back toward the city, the sprawling, impossible, beautiful mess of it. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment with crayon drawings on the fridge, a little boy was asleep, dreaming of robots and stars. Tomorrow, his mother would pick him up from school wearing a ring that caught the light. She'd tell him the truth, all of it. The struggle, the survival, the miracle of second chances. And he'd look up at her with those wide, believing eyes and say what he always said. "I knew you'd build something amazing, Mommy." The camera pulls back. Two figures on a rooftop, silhouetted against the glow of a city that had tried to break them both. Below, the world continues, indifferent, relentless, alive. But up here, in this moment, they've rewritten the ending. Not with code or capital or corner offices, but with something quieter, something stronger. Courage, love, and brilliance that refused to be unseen. Some stories don't start with crowns and glass slippers. They start with mops and mistake logs. But if you're brave enough to keep solving, they end the same way. Thank you for watching to the end. I believe you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting stories like this lined up for you already, so click the image showing on your screen to watch the next. Don't forget to subscribe.